Okay, fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our penultimate presentation. It's going to be a panel discussion on Partnering 101. Specifically, I'm a business, I'm a company. I've heard great things about Cloud Foundry. I'm really excited about this thing you call the ecosystem, but how do I engage? What is this Cloud Foundry? How do I get involved in the ecosystem? How do I directly integrate with Cloud Foundry? So I've decided to do this as a panel discussion and invited James, Scott, Mark, and Matt to join us. I'll actually have you guys introduce yourselves, and then we'll kind of jump into it.
Hi, I'm Scott Frederick, and I'm a platform engineer on the Cloud Foundry product team at Pivotal. So we just sort of fill in the gaps between engineering and our field teams and try to get the word about Cloud Foundry out there. I also maintain the Cloud Foundry Java API and the Maven and Gradle plugins in my spare time.
Hi, I'm James Bear. I'm on the Pivotal and Cloud Foundry product management teams, and really enjoy working on Cloud Foundry.
And hello, I'm Mark Kropf. I'm the product manager for the Cloud Foundry Runtime Funtime team, and I enjoy being here with all you guys. What's left?
Yeah, I'm Matt Stein. I'm another platform engineer along with Scott, and I got the privilege of spending a lot of time early on with Monsanto that keynoted on the first day of the conference, and also like to talk about this little-known thing called microservices.
Right on. And I am Nima Beatty. I'm responsible for business development and ecosystem partnerships for Cloud Foundry at Pivotal. So this panel actually started out as a blog post initially that I posted about 2 months ago, roughly. And the idea was we had a lot of questions from potential partners asking us, well, listen, we really want to work with Pivotal and or Cloud Foundry. How do we do either? So we wrote a brief blog post to that effect, and that stimulated a lot of great conversations. And I thought maybe it's great to talk about some of the guys on the front line and ask them the direct questions of what do you see partners wanting to do? How do you recommend doing that? And what's the best path forward? So let me go through. There are 3 principal ways to really get involved in the Cloud Foundry ecosystem if you're a business. The first is really to do a meaningful integration with the stack or any kind of service on top of it. The second is if you can do customizations of the Cloud Foundry code base, either during installation or for architectural consulting or actual product customizations for specific customers. And the final is really operationalizing Cloud Foundry, either on top of one stack or another. Offering managed hosting services, SaaS services, monitoring, support, and training. So basically everything that a potential customer might want. For today's talk, I'd like to really focus on the first part, the integration part, which is why I've asked the folks closest to Cloud Foundry, the product, to join us. Okay, so I'm going to go through the Cloud Foundry architecture and ask a couple of leading questions in certain specific areas, and then from there we'll go freeform. Does that sound good? All right. So if you guys haven't seen the slide before, this is the Hyper Cloud Foundry architecture. And what's really important to note is that implicit within the architecture are integration vectors for companies and businesses and partners to be able to work with Cloud Foundry, either the ecosystem as a whole or with specific modules and services. And some of the key areas are either it's an extensible service, implicit or explicit, either it's a functionality that's part of the core, or something that can run on top of Cloud Foundry. So let's jump on the first part, which is for applications that can run on top of Cloud Foundry. And if I'm a business with a cloud-native application or enterprise, old school, what are the recommendations you guys have for me as a company, to integrate with Cloud Foundry and get my stuff to run on Cloud Foundry? James, I'm going to start with you and then go around.
Sure, thanks, Nima. I think one of the things you have to realize are some of the constraints when you run on Cloud Foundry, what it means to be an app. So one of the things we've been talking about is this design pattern called 12-factor applications. And if you can look at it at 12factor.net, and it's a really nice approach for designing cloud-native applications. It expresses some ideas and some design patterns that are really well enforced in Cloud Foundry. They go together really well. An example of that is to not use stateful disk, is one example, and to use data services instead. There's some other things that are in there about separating your code and your configuration and things like that. So go check that one out and see about how the application that you have in mind maps up well with what a 12-factor app might be. And that tells you right away whether or not there's a good match for your application on Cloud Foundry. Now, just because you might say, oh, a couple of these things don't apply to me, I guess I can't do it. There might be some other things, and so you can engage with us on the mailing list and ask questions, and that's a good way to find out.
So if I'm an existing enterprise shop and a lot of my applications are, let's say, existing J2E or .NET, any recommendations on what I can do on top of Cloud Foundry or changes I should make?
One thing to keep in mind is that Cloud Foundry today only supports a single inbound HTTP port. So if your application depends on other things routing into it using some kind of TCP traffic that's not HTTP based, then you're going to have an issue potentially. And there's other things, maybe that just means you're not an application in Cloud Foundry, you can run as a Cloud Foundry service. But so understanding the difference between what Cloud Foundry conceives of an app and what it means to be a service, that's important in that scenario.
Great. Let's move on to another area. So the second is for services that have to be deployed locally, and I'm going to compare this to services that don't have to be local that might be able to go across the open internet. So for locally deployed services, maybe running on the exact same infrastructure, what are some considerations, and what's an ideal prototypical or archetypal service that could run? And if I wanted to BOSHify that service, what are things I can do as a business? Matt, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, I'll jump on that one. So I'm actually working on sort of a prototype of this right now for one of our customers with a content management system that they're very interested in running. And of course, you think about a lot of content management systems, sometimes they want to use local disk for a content repository, and then maybe they'd like to cluster that disk across multiple machines to share the content. So that type of a service doesn't really work very well on the Cloud Foundry runtime because of the fact that we only carry around ephemeral disk. But when I go into the BOSH world, now I have this ability to mount persistent disk and then have BOSH take care of managing the health of that cluster so that if I lose a node, I don't lose that content, it actually gets remounted for me. So when we see an app or a platform that's not going to work very well on the runtime, I immediately go say, okay, well, BOSH is a little bit more forgiving in terms of your architecture. Let's go see what it would look like to turn that into a BOSH release. And so then I start to decompose the platform into packages, start to think about how I want to manage the configuration, what type of options I want to give to a user in terms of dials that they can tune for their deployment. And then start to think about what it looks like to map that to the infrastructure of choice.
Okay. If for locally deployed services that may not be deployable via BOSH, what are the other options in terms of deployment scenarios? Or let's say, for example, I'm not an OSS product, maybe I'm proprietary code. Do I still have an option to be able to deploy?
Yeah, one of the.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You don't necessarily have to. So I've got a service that I have a very well-characterized operational pattern for running. I still want to integrate with Cloud Foundry, so I have a couple of options. First option would be obviously the user-provided services. So I can figure out how I would want to send connection details to a developer's application today. I create a user-provided service that exposes those details, and then they get the benefit of using the VCAP services binding like they do for brokered apps. If I want to go an extra step further, if it makes sense for me to write a service broker, if I'm going to be doing this a lot, it might be a little bit of a management burden to use user-provided services all the time, but the API is very well documented. And the coolest thing about writing service brokers is that it's very easy now to just push a service broker as an app to Cloud Foundry. So not only is it easy to develop, but it's also easy to take advantage of Cloud Foundry to manage your own extensions to the platform.
So, for example, if I have an IBM DB2 database or an Oracle database, I'm not necessarily excluded from the Cloud Foundry ecosystem. There's a really clean on-ramp for me to also use existing enterprise assets or things I already own.
Right.
Great, great.
I kind of see it more like your app or service can have different levels of integration into Cloud Foundry's ecosystem, and the furthest away might be a user-provided service. And then if you want to be able to deploy it at the same time so that all your environments are being set up with the same services, even if it is proprietary, getting it to be BOSH deployed is kind of the next step. And then you can go a step further and having a broker possibly to your app or service. And then finally, if you've got your service or app far enough, you could have it actually hosted on Cloud Foundry.
Gotcha.
So like, it depends where you are in that journey. If you're starting out with an app that is a legacy app that already abides by most of the 12-factor app type of constraints, then great, you can jump right to the end. But I think each enterprise can choose what fits them best.
Fabulous. Flip side of the same coin, talking about, actually, I'll come to that one in a second. I would like to integrate something very specific to the stack. So for example, I'm WebEx, like Ken owns the presentation this morning, and I'd like to run UDP traffic on top of the router, but currently the router doesn't support it. Or there's a module I just want to straight out rip out and replace with my own. What are the different ways I can do that, and is that supported by the Cloud Foundry ecosystem?
Well, today, like we discussed in the previous question, the inbound traffic into the router is only HTTP traffic, with the slight addition that we can handle WebSocket upgrades. In the future, we are considering how we could accommodate other kind of patterns, but when you look at what the MySQL service, for example, when they're going to do their HA deployment, their pattern is going to be to use HA proxy or something like that. So there certainly are ways that you can get network traffic into the platform. In this case, it's going to be a service that's off to the side of Cloud Foundry that Cloud Foundry applications can use that will be taking TCP traffic in and be load balanced across all their instances. So absolutely, Cloud Foundry does not impose any network constraints on you itself. It's up to whatever infrastructure you're deploying into, what kind of network rules the infrastructure has put in place or the policies that the customer has. But you could certainly use HA proxy or something like that and embed that with your service.
So certainly no one's going to rewrite Diego or any of the core Cloud Foundry components, but is it conceivable that I, as a commercial provider, could maybe sell a different version of the router that has a lot more whiz-bang features that isn't currently in Cloud Foundry? Could we foresee a future where that could potentially have an ecosystem of both open source and commercial components blended together?
Yeah, the way I look at that from a product standpoint is I try and identify places where we can have really nice extension APIs, as opposed to saying replace the entire implementation. So when you look at something like the Service Broker, that's an example of some place where we have a really nice extension mechanism where, like if you look at, let's take Bluemix, for example, from IBM, they have a lot of IBM software that they have now written as services that are not open source software. It's proprietary IBM software that you couldn't install in some other open source Cloud Foundry unless they make it available for that. But yet, they're able to use open source Cloud Foundry as a base and extend it with those services. And an application is another example of that. Like you could bring a proprietary application onto Cloud Foundry and it works just fine as long as you follow this 12-factor pattern. And so if you look at other areas, like some place could be like the router, where you might have a pluggable network access policy module of some kind, where if you have third-party software providers that are doing some kind of network boundary checking for authorizations, you could imagine a future where we could have something like that. That is not currently spec'd out, and so if you're interested in something like that, you have to approach us, and we'd love to hear about some kind of extension point that you need to bring to the platform. We're very open to those discussions.
And then for less invasive integrations, maybe something like adding some intelligence to one of the build packs that would detect a service like AppDynamics or New Relic. What are recommendations for the audience or the greater ecosystem in terms of allowing them to actually promote that or even submit changes to the stack?
Yeah, I mean, build packs are almost by definition open source. It'd be pretty hard to have a build pack that was closed source. So we heard about the Java build pack earlier yesterday. The Java build pack was designed from the ground up to be extensible. So it's really easy to take that build pack and add new components, new frameworks to it, and then provide those. We've already seen that with the WebSphere Liberty Profile, with WebLogic, and with JBoss. Those are 3 build packs that are forks of the main Java build pack. And our other build packs that are coming out either by Pivotal or by other members of the community have similar extension capabilities in them. Now with the latest versions of Cloud Foundry, it's easy just to take a zip of a build pack, upload it to your Cloud Foundry deployment, and it's available.
And then today, we do have a concept of commercial build packs, so we don't necessarily sell them. I can, as a business, maybe create a proprietary build pack, and go ahead and sell that as part of the greater ecosystem, right?
Yeah,
In fact,
you definitely can.
recently we have received some contributions from IBM that help us actually meter the usage of build packs. So in the cloud controller of Cloud Foundry, we do in the API produce something called an app usage event, and it's what we use on Pivotal Web Services, and it's what some of our partners use to be able to do metrics and audit usage for billing or other purposes. And in that data, there is now build pack data. So you could start metering and billing based on build pack usage.
Gotcha. Scott, the next section we're going to get into is, so we talked about local services. What about SaaS-based services? Let me just skip through that one. Things like New Relic or SendGrid. What are some of the patterns that you've seen that you would recommend promoting for commercial entities who want to actually add on services to Cloud Foundry, but not necessarily modify anything on the stack?
Yeah, the nice thing about services with the V2 API is that services API is extremely flexible now. So you just implement 5 REST endpoints in your service broker and register with Cloud Foundry. And inside of that service broker, you can do anything you want. So a service broker could be something as simple as just make a call out to provision an account and you're getting back account credentials, and that's really all the broker's doing is creating an account, all the way up to actually provisioning resources in some back end. So the V2 Service Broker API really makes anything possible when it comes to service brokers.
Great. And then do I really need a sandbox or access to a running Cloud Foundry instance to be able to create either add-on services or locally deployed services?
For testing service brokers, it's nice to do that. And BOSH Lite is a really good tool that you can use to do that. It's in the Cloud Foundry GitHub organization. You can deploy your own small Cloud Foundry locally and test registering your service broker to the cloud controller and test that interaction very easily with BOSH Lite.
Gotcha. Moving on to the next area. Oops, I'm going to go back one. So I'm going to actually call this out. I know you were very intimately involved with the integration we had with AppDirect, where we actually use a broker to broker connections to other add-on services, and this is certainly one pattern we've seen. Any particular insights we gleaned from that experience that you guys want to share?
Well, AppDirect is an interesting one in that it's kind of a meta broker in a sense, in that most service brokers will broker exactly one type of service. AppDirect brokers a wide range of services. So it's basically a mapping layer between the Cloud Foundry Service Broker API and other external services. And the fact that it can be registered with any Cloud Foundry deployment, I think, is a really good model for what service brokers should be.
Great. Mark, you touched on this before with the user-provided instance. Can we talk about what that is and what the benefit is in terms of at what point do I decide a UPI is not necessarily what I need? I should do a much more meaningful integration where perhaps Cloud Foundry can have provisioning controls over that service.
Yeah, so when you have a user-provided service, it's a different type of experience. You're going to have to wire that up every time you do an app push for that app. You're going to have to define that either in your app manifest or at push time. Whereas if you have a service broker, you can have it provision that service entity instance, in this case, when your app needs it. So if I push it to 3 different environments, as long as that broker is available in all 3, I'll get the same type of provisioning and result. Where with a user-provided service instance, you're going to have to go and do that work yourself and make sure that that service is provisioned ahead of time before your app can go in. So at the point in which that becomes too laborious and you want to start enabling others to go and bring up connectivity to that service is when it makes sense to look at the broker.
Yeah. The final area is really the underlying infrastructure, was what Cloud Foundry sits on top of. So today we support VMware, OpenStack, Amazon. I know we're experimenting with Google Compute. Can you talk a little bit about the decoupling of the BOSH CPI from BOSH itself and what we can potentially see and what we'd like to see in the future in terms of underlying infrastructure support?
Yeah, so BOSH team's working on CPI extraction right now, and really what that's about is making sure that the defined CPI has everything it needs to interact with an IS. When that's done, it would be possible for a third party to go and implement a CPI to almost anything, whether it be an IS or something like a bunch of containers like we do for BOSH Lite. And I think that'll be important because today, if you wanted to do something that's atypical, while the CPI definition seems rather plain, if BOSH itself needed something to be able to work with that IS, it's not well segregated today. So that's ongoing. You probably.
Okay. Beyond this, the architecture discussion, what are some recommendations, and I'm going to ask this of each of you, in terms of anti-patterns? What are things that partners should not do? Maybe areas they shouldn't touch or integration path they shouldn't go down? And Matt, I'll start with you.
Saying nothing comes to mind right off the bat.
So everything is possible.
Surprised
Everything
me.
and
I
anything
thought I
is
had
possible.
3 people to work through before I.
I've got one. I've got one.
James.
So
We strongly discourage forks of the Cloud Foundry code base. That's why we're doing external CPIs,
Right.
for example, because when people were doing BOSH CPI development, it typically, even though it's only 12 to 14 API implementations, but like snapshot a VM, create a VM, manage networks, things like that, it can take you a while to develop that. Meanwhile, while you have this fork, Cloud Foundry develop marches on. And so what you've seen from some either customers or other commercial vendors that have done some forks of the code base, it's harder to get back on the train.
Yeah.
So I would highly encourage you or discourage you from actually forking Cloud Foundry code and talk to us about an extension point that can do the things you need it to do before you go down that path. Other anti-patterns, I would say, like I gave the roadmap presentation earlier today. Go check out the roadmap and see where we're going, and try not to completely just do something that we're planning on doing that might make something you do obsolete. And if you can give us some heads up by working with Nima or working by the relevant people on the team, we can make sure that there's some collaboration, co-opetition, or whatever their kind of understanding needs to happen so that we know what someone's doing as opposed to there being a surprise after you've invested 3 months developing something.
So an anti-pattern is anti-transparency. If you're
Right.
going to do something, let us know, talk to us first before you go off and end up in a dead end.
If you don't have to divulge the entire secret of your secret plan, if it's going to take over the world, but you might want to at least give us a hint of the area that it might be in and a generalized sense for what kinds of things you might try and do so we can give you some guidance that it's either a good or bad idea or steer you a right direction.
Gotcha.
And that's the same even if you're going to contribute back into this code base. What I try to tell community folks is the scope of your change should determine the scope and how much time you give yourself to communicate. So if it's a minute change and you're helping us get the code base free of bugs or making it slightly more performant but in the same design architecture we have, great. We love to see those pull requests. We pull in tens a week, and we'll keep doing that. If it's something that's going to change the design of what Cloud Foundry is or does or how it does it, you know what? Open an issue, email myself or email someone on the team, the relevant person, and let's have a conversation so that at least when you go and invest all that time and work to get a contribution, we can easily bring that in and it doesn't start a conversation after you've already done all the work. And then if it's a dramatic change, yeah, let's sit down and work that out. We've actually worked with some of our community folks that have forked environments, and one that's been rather public in our mailing list, the LDS Church has done an amazing job working with us, and we've stepped through a lot of different things that they need in their environment, and now they're in Cloud Foundry, and Cloud Foundry users are benefiting from that interaction. So I think it's about collaborating with us and allowing us to be your design partner in what you're trying to do so that we can pull it in quickly. And if you're not going to submit it in, if it's proprietary, at least you know really good integration points so that you don't have to be on the treadmill and having to maintain a fork.
Great. So my final question to all 4 of you is, if you could have one ask, one thing on your wish list that you'd like to see from the community or from a partner or from some commercial entity, say, here, buy this, what would it be?
For me, it's services. I just don't think we can have too many services, even multiple vendors providing services to the same sort of data source. I think when it comes to portability, one of the big factors in portability are the same services available on any Cloud Foundry-based platform you may want to push to. So I think the more services we can get into the ecosystem, the better.
More services. James?
I'm really passionate about the lifecycle management aspects, so source code control to the CI systems to performance testing, some of those things. So some of the things that so far we've taken care of running applications and attaching them to services. And there's a whole range of activities that happen in the application development lifecycle that are outside of the scope of those things. So starting to layer on other integrations that cover that's something I'm really passionate about. I'd love to see more of that.
So more and better ALM tools and single pane of glass.
Right.
Perfect.
And for me, I selfishly want to have more use cases and how our users out there in the community or customers are using the product, and getting that feedback and being active in the community, whether it be contributing to our docs repo or adding build packs or services like Scott said. Like just being a part of what makes Cloud Foundry awesome is the ecosystem and the community that we're building, and seeing folks as active as a lot of the folks that have been here this week.
So from my perspective, I think, I've talked a lot about microservices this week, and I said that Cloud Foundry addresses a lot of the gaps and things that we deal with when we start to move towards that architecture, but there are places that we have more work to do. One of those areas is in API gateways. Pivotal's working on mobile products to address that, but I'd love to see an ecosystem emerge around that, less monolithic products and things that kind of take our application deployment model into account. Also, things like service registries. What would it look like for when I deploy my app? Not only do my services appear in a marketplace, but now my applications that have REST APIs appear in a marketplace as well. And then I can have apps binding to apps and brokering security and centralizing the management of that so that I can enable myself to fill those remaining gaps and areas that seem kind of scary at this point when you start taking an enterprise's monolith and decomposing it into units. How do I glue all that back together? I think if we start to really think about what could we do with Cloud Foundry to fix those issues, that would be great.
Perfect. Well, guys, that's it for us. Thank you very much for your time and the great feedback. We'll be around if you guys have any questions, so we'll be walking the aisles. And I highly suggest, if you haven't, to join the VCAP Google groups and the BOSH Google groups, and just get on Twitter. Feel free to ask questions in an open forum. That way we can get back to you and give you the answers you're looking for. Thank you very much.